This isn't just history, it's horror in stone. From tortured souls to vanished princes, the Tower of London is packed with more ghosts than a Tudor family reunion. Let's step inside. Just don't expect to leave alone. Welcome back, my dark-hearted demons. Today we're diving into the twisted, ghost-soaked history of one of the most infamous buildings in the entire world. If you thought the Tower of London was just a pretty postcard backdrop or a nice spot for a royal beheading, well, you'd be half right. But before it became the supernatural hotspot we know today, it started with a bloke who really knew how to make an entrance. The one, the only, William the Conqueror. Yes, William. The man who looked at England in 1066 and said, this could use a touch more oppression. Within just 3 months of smashing Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, William was already hammering away at his next conquest, the skyline of London. He began by plonking down a timber and earth fortress on the north bank of the Thames. It wasn't even the capital at the time, but it was the biggest city. Naturally, he thought, let's loom ominously over it. This early fort sat on the remnants of ancient Roman walls because nothing says new regime like building your castle on literal ruins of the past. He also built castles at Dover, Canterbury, Winchester, Pevensey. Basically, if you stood still long enough in 11th century England, William would build a castle on you. By the end of his reign, the Conqueror had overseen the creation of 80 castles, like he was playing an aggressive game of medieval Monopoly. And after his son, William Rufus, took the throne, that number skyrocketed past 100. Because clearly, nothing says please don't rebel like a stone fortress on every other hill. But of all these medieval masterpieces, it was one castle that stood out. One tower that struck awe, dread, and possibly indigestion into the hearts of the Anglo-Saxon population. A rectangular slab of fear, known as the White Tower. That's right, the original heart of the Tower of London wasn't just for show. It was a very literal power move. A giant Norman flex looming over London like a stone middle finger to anyone still clinging to the old Anglo-Saxon ways. To the conquered, it wasn't just a building. It was a chilling monument to their new overlord. Towering, alien, and full of foreign soldiers who didn't exactly arrive bearing cupcakes. This was the beginning of a new era. The feudal system had officially moved in, and it brought in its own brand of hospitality. Spoiler alert, it included dungeons. Now, before we go poking around the tower's haunted hallways any further, we need to understand the system that made it all possible. The machine behind the monarchy, the code behind the crown, feudalism, where your freedom was negotiable, your sword was your CV, and loyalty was a bit of a, let's say, fluid concept. In its simplest form, feudalism was like an extremely aggressive landlord-tenant agreement. The king or a powerful lord owned the land, and I mean all of it, and in return for a nice slice of it, his vassals promised to serve him, mostly with swords. It was less, can I pay an exposure, and more, you fight for me, or you don't eat. Basically, Uber Eats, but you're the horse. After the collapse of central government in 9th century Europe, helped along by the Vikings, who really weren't known for their conflict resolution skills, kings, lords, and even the church carved out huge chunks of land and ran them like independent states. These estates were self-sufficient. Think of them like medieval franchises. They produced their own food, managed their own laws, and usually had someone in armour lurking about to enforce them. Lords kept the best bits for themselves, naturally, and leased the rest to tenants, who paid in crops, loyalty, and the occasional bloodshed. If you were born into it, you were probably stuck there forever. You didn't have to love your job, you just had to pass it down to your kids. Now, some lords owned multiple estates, a sort of medieval Airbnb situation. So instead of moving grain across the country, they just moved themselves. They'd rock up with a band of retainers, hold court, settle some local disputes, collect a few taxes, and then disappear to the next estate. Government on tour, if you will. Nothing says authority like showing up once a year and shouting at the villagers. Beneath the lords were the knights, your classic sword-swinging, horse-riding, chainmail-clinking types. They swore oaths of loyalty, fought in their lords' wars, and sometimes even got their own little plots of land. If they were really good, or at least just not dead, their sons would inherit the lot. And that is where we get the term feudal from. Feudum, Latin for the land and privileges granted to a vassal. Land, titles, tax breaks, and a shiny suit of armour. Not bad if you liked bleeding for someone else's problems. But here's the twist. Feudalism wasn't a flawless hierarchy of honour and trust. Vassals could, and frequently did, ditch their lords for a better offer, or simply start a war over a cow. Rebellions, betrayals and turf wars became a staple of European life, lasting centuries. Think of it as Game of Thrones without the huge budget. And just like today's influencers, loyalty was always for sale. England had flirted with feudal ideas before 1066, but it wasn't until William the Conqueror barged in with his elite army of Norman landlords that the real system was installed, like downloading a whole new operating system. One that came with knights, taxes, and a serious lack of personal freedom. So, what right did William have to impose this on the English? Well, apparently the right of conquest and a very persuasive sword. Feudalism wasn't just a system, it was the backbone of everything that happened next. Every ghost story at the Tower, every wrongful execution, every blood-soaked betrayal. All built on land, loyalty, and a well-placed blade. Now let's clear something up. William of Normandy didn't sail across the Channel with a few thousand knights and squires to spread enlightenment and baguettes. This was not a cultural outreach programme. It was a hostile takeover. Anyone who tells you the Normans came to civilise the English is probably selling chainmail. You see, at the time, the English didn't need civilising. By the time 1066 rolled around, they'd already been rubbing elbows with European politics, art, religion, and law for centuries. What happened wasn't progress, it was possession. William, Duke of Normandy and part-time professional grudge holder, believed he'd been promised the throne of England by Edward the Confessor himself. But when Edward died, the English council said thanks, but no thanks, and handed the crown to Harold Godwinson instead. Edward's top advisor and a man with no royal blood, but a very fine moustache. William's response? Classic. Gather a few thousand heavily armed friends and burn that decision to the ground. Just 9 months later, in October 1066, the Battle of Hastings happened. Harold died with an arrow in his eye. His army was crushed and William became the most powerful man anywhere in the country. Funnily enough, most of the power had just died on the battlefield. Suddenly, England was like an abandoned house, and William, he had the keys, and about 7,000 heavily armed roommates. But here's the catch. William didn't just win a kingdom, he won expectations. His vassals, those loyal Norman lords and knights who'd fought at his side, didn't do it for fun. They wanted land, wealth, status, and possibly a nice chunk of Sussex. William knew he had to deliver, but he wasn't foolish. He didn't just hand out entire counties to his favourites like medieval party bags. Instead, he fragmented his rewards by giving each vassal small parcels of land, scattered across the country. That way, no one noble became too powerful in one area. Divide and rule, the ultimate power play. Smart, ruthless, classic William. And then came the castles. Oh yes, William wasn't just throwing land around, he was handing out permission slips to build fortresses. But make no mistake, every castle came with a clear message. You only have this because I let you have it. And what William gave, William could take away, with interest. This was the beginning of castle licensing, a policy that later became formalised in law. You couldn't just build a massive stone keep anywhere you fancied. That was the king's privilege. The castles were both a reward and a leash, a place to defend, and a reminder of who was really in charge. And so this is where it begins. Not with ghosts, not with royalty, and certainly not with a yeoman warder in a souvenir shop, but with dirt, timber and one very serious trench. The Tower of London started out humbly, more medieval building sites than Fortress of Doom. After the Battle of Hastings, William didn't march straight into London like some triumphant Roman emperor. No, our Duke of Normandy took the scenic route via Dover, Canterbury, Winchester, Wallingford. A lovely little tour of intimidation. Nothing screams welcome your new king like building castles along the way, just in case anyone gets any ideas. By the time he reached Berkhamsted, the local Anglo-Saxon lords had read the room. They submitted. William got coronated on Christmas Day at Westminster Abbey, in the same spot where Edward the Confessor had once ruled. Festive, slightly tense, and naturally, a little bit violent. Norman soldiers apparently thought the London mob needed crowd control, with swords. To keep the newly acquired kingdom in check, William sent an advance party into London ahead of him. Their job? Throw up fortifications fast, called munitions, designed to intimidate, protect, and if needed, flatten. These included two early castles, Baynard's Castle to the southwest of the Tower of London, and Montfichet to the north near the present Ludgate Circus. That modest beginning, that's the seed of what would become the Tower of London. A palisade, a ditch, and an unspoken promise. Step out of line and this won't be the last thing we build on your ashes. Very soon the modest timber compound gave way to something far more permanent. A massive stone donjon. What we now call the White Tower. Built within 15 years of the conquest, it wasn't just a stronghold. It was a statement. A royal palace and a fortress rolled into one. Somewhere you could rule from and chain people up in the basement. A perfect blend of majesty and menace, like Buckingham Palace if it had a dungeon. Over time the tower grew teeth, more towers, inner and outer walls, gates within gates. Eventually it became a full concentric castle, a rarity in England and not exactly cheap. The medieval version of going full premium. It's the kind of place that says, I've conquered your lands and I have the receipts to prove it. Modern excavations reveal parts of the original layouts, ditches still traceable today, some 8 metres wide and 3.5 metres deep. The White Tower was squeezed into an awkward corner, almost hugging the ancient Roman wall like a poorly planned extension. Honestly, it looks like the builders forgot to measure first. There was barely room for scaffolding, but build it they did. And the result still looms over London like a bad omen that never left. By the reign of William's son, the White Tower was complete. Its stone walls now baked with centuries of blood, betrayal, and echoes. From Timber Trench to terrifying Titan, the Tower of London was born not just of strategy, but domination. And soon it would become something far more sinister. Now, conquering a kingdom is one thing, keeping it in the family, that's where the real bloodletting begins. Because if you thought William the Conqueror was intense, wait until you meet his sons. When William the Conqueror finally met his maker in 1087 after falling off a horse and dying from internal injuries, a rather undignified exit for such a dramatic man, he left behind more than just a scarred kingdom and a few traumatised Saxons. He left behind 4 sons, and if you think one medieval warlord was bad enough, try raising 4 of them. Think of it like a royal family drama, but with swords, betrayals, and significantly worse haircuts. Let's start with the eldest, Robert Curthose, a name that sounds like he's halfway to a Monty Python sketch, and honestly, the story doesn't do much to disprove that. Robert was Duke of Normandy, ambitious, proud, and perpetually in conflict with his father and brothers. At one point, he literally fought his dad in battle, accidentally unhorsed him, then panicked and fled. Can you imagine unseating the conqueror and then running away before the grounding kicked in? Then came William Rufus, the second son and heir to the English crown. Under William Rufus, work on the Tower of London continued. Fortifications expanded, power consolidated. The White Tower was now not only a palace and fortress, but the Crown's primary stronghold in London. It was a statement, a safe house, and soon, a prison. But Rufus didn't get to enjoy it for long. In 1100, William Rufus went on a nice, relaxing hunting trip in the New Forest, and left it with an arrow in his chest. Accident? Assassination? Divine punishment? We'll never know. His killer, Walter Tyrrell, fled the scene immediately, which is always a good look when someone dies accidentally. Just a suggestion. If your king gets shot and you immediately leg it to France, people might start asking questions. Now, I'm not saying it was an assassination or anything. I'm just saying William's brother Henry was very quick to claim the crown. Ah yes, Henry I, the youngest of the three full-blooded sons. Calm, clever, calculating. Known as Henry Beauclerk for his education, he wasted no time after William Rufus's death. Legend has it that Henry rushed straight to Winchester and seized the royal treasury before dust had even settled on his brother's body. Now that's what we call seizing the moment. Henry I crowned himself just days after Rufus's death, promising to restore justice and mend the rift between the monarchy and the church. Which, let's be honest, wasn't that hard given his brother had practically excommunicated in spirit. He married a Saxon princess, issued the Charter of Liberties to win public favour, and leaned heavily into bureaucracy. He was less of a warrior king, more of a spreadsheet monarch, and under him, England's royal administration really began to form. The Tower? Still crucial. Under Henry it remained a military garrison, a royal residence, and now increasingly a tool of political control. Powerful enemies and rebellious nobles started to find themselves housed in it, not as guests, but as occupants of very cold, very echoey rooms. And finally there was Richard, the forgotten son. He died young, likely in a hunting accident, and vanished into the background of history, like an extra in someone else's drama. His death didn't exactly shake the kingdom, but it did spare him the exhausting backstabbing that defined the rest of his family. In all honesty, he was probably the lucky one. 4 sons, 1 throne, endless rivalry. Their lives shaped the early Norman kingdom, sometimes by ruling it, sometimes by trying to burn it down, and sometimes by accidentally killing each other's deer. And behind it all, the Tower of London loomed, watching silently as the bloodline tangled itself into knots. The Tower of London, where the beds are stone and the door only locks from the outside. So between William Rufus's fiery reign and Henry I's administrative lockdown, the Tower cemented itself as more than just a castle. It was now a living, growing embodiment of royal authority. A symbol of power, yes, but also a looming threat. And the walls were starting to remember. Now, if the Normans were the storm that conquered England, the Plantagenets were the long, slow thunder that followed. Loud, relentless, and occasionally deadly. The name sounds like a medieval gardening club, but trust me, this was less pruning roses and more pruning family members. The first Plantagenet king, Henry II, was the great-grandson of William the Conqueror, through his daughter Matilda. When he took the throne in 1154, England had just stumbled through nearly 2 decades of civil war. A delightful little era known as the Anarchy, when everyone was fighting and nobody seemed to be winning. So naturally, Henry showed up and decided what the kingdom really needed was more control. Henry II was a reformer, efficient, relentless, and ruthlessly intelligent. He rebuilt royal authority, strengthened the courts, and began turning England into a proper kingdom once again. But he also had a temper that could boil oceans, and family issues that would have made a therapist cry. Just imagine for 1 second being so terrifying that your own sons start a civil war just to get out of Sunday dinner. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most powerful women in all of Europe. His sons, Richard the Lionheart, John, and a few others who didn't make the highlights reel, spent more time rebelling against him than ruling anything. And that's before we even get to the part where he accidentally creates a saint by having his good old friend Thomas Becket murdered in a cathedral. 4 knights, 1 archbishop, 0 survivors. Henry didn't explicitly tell them to do it, of course. He just said, and I quote, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Classic Plantagenet passive aggression. Under the early Plantagenets, the Tower of London grew in size and importance. More towers were added, defensive features expanded. It housed royal treasure, political prisoners, and occasionally members of the royal family who needed a quiet place to rethink their life choices. The tower was no longer just a fortress, it was the Plantagenet storage box for inconvenient people. And as the power struggles continued between kings and barons, fathers and sons, the tower listened. It absorbed every betrayal, every secret, every whispered confession scratched into the stone by candlelight. Now, if Henry II was the iron fist of the Plantagenets, his sons were the fists that punched each other. Meet Richard the Lionheart and John. 2 brothers, 1 crown, and absolutely 0 family dinners without weapons. Let's start with Richard I, the Lionheart, warrior, crusader, absentee landlord. He spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, and most of that was asking where the boats were. To be fair to him, Richard didn't hate England, he just preferred being somewhere else, fighting, mostly in the Holy Land, occasionally in France, occasionally against his own family. Richard led the Third Crusade, storming castles, clashing with Saladin, and earning himself a place in the history books as a chivalric hero. Though, let's be honest, if you were a commoner back home, you mostly just noticed the part where he bankrupted the kingdom to fund it all. Richard's idea of ruling was, take my taxes, keep the throne warm, and I'll send postcards from Jerusalem. Which brings us to John, Richard's younger brother, the one history remembers with a sneer. While Richard was off fighting, John tried to steal his crown. Failed. Then tried again when Richard got imprisoned on the way home. Failed again. But when Richard finally died from a crossbow wound after spending years winning battles and surviving sieges, John finally got his prize. Which is a bit like inheriting the family estate after setting it on fire 3 times. As king, John ruled with all the charm of a kicked beehive. He raised taxes, alienated the barons, lost nearly all of England's land in France, and had an unfortunate habit of accidentally starving political prisoners to death. He was the kind of king who'd tax your candlelight, then blame you for the dark. One of the darkest chapters of John's reign involved his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a potential rival for the throne. Captured, imprisoned, and then mysteriously vanished. Most historians agree John had him quietly murdered, possibly by his very own hand. And if you're wondering where Arthur was held before he disappeared, yes, the Tower of London. Eventually, the barons had enough. In 1215, they forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a document limiting royal power and laying the groundwork for constitutional law. It was signed under duress. John didn't mean a word of it, and civil war broke out almost immediately. But the tower still stood, a last line of defence, a symbol of royal power, even when the king was crumbling. John died in 1216, possibly of dysentery, definitely of unpopularity, and the ghosts of his victims never really left the tower. Richard and John, one ruled with a sword, the other with suspicion. Between them, they shaped the monarchy, strained the nobility, and gave the Tower of London more than enough reasons to stay haunted. After the chaos of King John, England needed a reset, and along came Henry III. He was crowned at just 9 years old and reigned for nearly 60 years, which gave him plenty of time to leave his mark. And one of the places he marked the most? The Tower. He basically turned it into a royal palace with security features, sort of a cross between Buckingham Palace and Alcatraz. Henry wasn't much of a warrior, but he was a builder. He added towers, royal apartments, and even tried to make the place look a little prettier. which was a bit like placing lace curtains on the guillotine. But his reign wasn't all renovations. The Barons' Wars erupted, led by the rebellious Simon de Montfort. Henry was captured. The Tower held firm. And by the time the dust had settled, England had taken one cautious step towards something that looked a little bit like a parliament. The next few centuries saw a royal carousel of Edwards, each one slightly more warlike or unfortunate than the last. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward II, overthrown by his very own wife. Edward III, obsessed with chivalry and conquest. Honestly, if your name was Edward in the 14th century, your life was either epic or terminal. Then came Richard II. Spoiled, vain, deposed. The Tower became his gilded prison before he was quietly removed with extreme prejudice by Henry IV. England plunged into the Wars of the Roses. The Tower became less royal residence, more revolving door of doomed nobles. Henry VI was imprisoned there twice. He died there too, probably murdered, maybe whispered to by the ghosts of his enemies. In 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly. His eldest son, Edward V, just 12 years old, was declared the next King of England. But before the crown could even warm his brow, he was swept into the Tower of London, officially for his own protection. Because when you're 12 years old, nothing says safe place like armed guards and a fortress full of political rivals. Edward was then joined by his younger brother, Richard, who was the Duke of York at just 9 years old. The two boys were kept in royal apartments, just as tradition dictated, but their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was already becoming increasingly suspicious, and with good reason. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been named Lord Protector, the man meant to safeguard the boys' future. But, instead, he declared their parents' marriage invalid, their claim to the throne illegitimate, and took the crown for himself. And so Richard III became king, and the princes became inconvenient. After that, the boys were seen less and less. Occasional glimpses at the windows, a sighting in the gardens here and there, and then nothing. No official record of their deaths. No funeral, no grave. They simply vanished, silently and completely. Two royal children disappeared from the most heavily guarded building in the realm, and for over 500 years, England has asked one question: what happened to them? The leading suspect was Richard III himself. After all, he had the means, the motive, and an alarmingly open calendar. The boys stood between him and absolute security on the throne. And let's just say medieval kings weren't known for their restraint. But others point to Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard and founded the mighty Tudor dynasty. If the boys were alive after Richard's fall, Henry had just as much reason to silence them, and far more incentive to make sure nobody asked too many questions. It's safe to say royal politics was the only thing more dangerous than open warfare. The truth we may never know. In 1674, workmen at the tower discovered two small skeletons beneath the staircase in the White Tower. They were buried without ceremony, coiled together, the bones of children. Many believe they were Edward and Richard, moved in the night, killed by someone whose name is now lost to time. Then finally, the chaos ended with Henry VII. Cold, cautious, and clever. He took the throne in 1485 and founded the Tudor dynasty. And then came him. Henry VIII, bluff King Hal, 6 wives, countless enemies, and a personal relationship with the Tower of London that swung between celebration and execution. Henry used the tower like a Swiss army knife. He crowned queens there, he imprisoned traitors, and when he got bored of someone, he had them beheaded just a short walk from his private rooms. He stayed there before his coronation in 1509. He expanded it, fortified it, filled it with weapons, gold, and dread. Under his rule, the tower was no longer a refuge. It was a stage, a place for betrayal to play out in public. And in 1536, the performance reached its most tragic, unforgettable scene. Anne Boleyn, his second wife, crowned queen in the Tower, and just 3 years later, dragged back through the gates as its prisoner. She was charged with adultery, incest and treason, a cocktail of lies whipped up by a king who'd grown tired of her. She was held in the same royal apartments she once ruled from, only this time the windows looked out over her own execution site. On May 19th, 1536, she walked to the scaffold at Tower Green with grace, dignity, and no hope. She knelt down as she forgave the king. She waited for the French executioner. One swift stroke, and Anne Boleyn became the most famous ghost in the Tower's long, blood-stained history. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn's head fell into the straw, and with it something else began to fall. Slowly, quietly, and at first unnoticed, Henry VIII himself. Because after Anne, it wasn't just wives who started dying, it was trust, loyalty, reputation, and eventually the king himself. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. She gave him the one thing Anne couldn't, a son, Edward VI. But unfortunately, Jane died of complications less than 2 weeks later, and with her, Henry's last chance at anything resembling happiness. 3 wives in, 2 dead, one exhausted monarch clinging to the idea that this was all perfectly normal. In the years that followed, Henry turned inwards and turned on everyone else. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, both loyal servants and trusted advisors, now gone. The Tower of London had never been busier. Anyone who challenged him, and I mean anyone, ended up here facing the axe, the noose, or the block. Heresy, treason, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The charges hardly mattered anymore. It was no longer justice. It was fear in the form of a crown. Wives came and went. Anne of Cleves was divorced. Catherine Howard was beheaded, right here at the Tower, just like Anne Boleyn. She was barely more than a teenager, accused of adultery, dragged screaming to her death. She asked for the executioner's block the night before so she could practice, because that's what royal marriage had become. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was unrecognisable. He was bloated and paranoid, racked with pain from a leg wound, likely from a jousting accident in his youth that simply refused to heal. It became ulcerated and infected, festering and foul-smelling, so much so that courtiers could smell the king before they saw him. A once great warrior, now rotting alive from the knee down, charming. He lashed out at those around him, growing increasingly cruel. He spoke of himself as some kind of living god, while doctors drained his leg, and servants tried not to gag. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died at the age of 55. He was enormous. Estimates suggested he weighed around 28 stone. His body was so bloated, so decayed that it reportedly burst open in its coffin on the journey to the burial. I would not have wanted to have been carrying that coffin, that's for damn sure. Yes, Henry didn't just die, he literally unravelled, bursting at the seams. He was buried next to Jane Seymour, the only wife he seemed to mourn. And above him, the stone lies heavy, cracked and silent. But even in death, the Tower of London remains tangled in his legacy. Ghosts of those he condemned, wives, friends, enemies, are said to drift through its corridors, and sometimes people say they feel him, still watching, still judging, still not quite finished. When Henry VIII died, his crown didn't pass to a seasoned warrior or a cunning politician. It landed on the narrow shoulders of a child. Edward VI, at just 9 years old, was crowned King of England, but unfortunately the young king was already dying. Edward was bright, Protestant, and far too young to rule, so the real power fell to his regents, men like Edward Seymour and John Dudley. Ambitious and ruthless, but terrified of what would happen if England slipped back into Catholic hands. Because nothing says stability like letting 2 political sharks babysit a kingdom. Edward's short reign was a storm of religious reform, social unrest and silent suffering. He was sickly, likely from tuberculosis, and by the time he turned 15, his death was no longer a possibility. It was a schedule. and with death looming, the Protestant nobility scrambled. They couldn't let the throne fall to Edward's Catholic sister Mary, so they turned to someone else. Lady Jane Grey, Edward's cousin, brilliant, bookish, devout, and tragically convenient. She never asked to be queen, but in July of 1553, they made her one anyway. She entered the Tower as Queen of England, a title she held for just 9 days, earning her the unfortunate title of the 9 Days Queen. Mary Tudor rallied support, marched on London, and the people, tired of puppet kings and manipulated child monarchs, sided with her. Jane's reign collapsed without a single battle, and suddenly this quiet, terrified teenager became a traitor. She was imprisoned in the very palace she had ruled from days earlier. Her fate was sealed by men who vanished into the shadows the moment the tide turned. Jane was held in the Tower's gentleman jailers' lodgings. She wrote letters and prayed constantly whilst she awaited her impending doom, and on the 12th of February 1554, she was taken to the scaffold. She faced death calmly, forgave her executioner, and blindfolded herself before kneeling, only to fumble helplessly in search of the block. She cried, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A stranger guided her hand, and the axe fell. Visitors still claim to see a pale girl in Tudor dress at the window of the Tower's upper rooms, looking out as if hoping the crowd might come back and change their minds. Others report sobbing on cold February mornings near the scaffold site, a hand on the shoulder, a whisper of prayer. Lady Jane Grey, Queen for 9 days, condemned for her bloodline, and perhaps still searching for justice from a world that used her, then erased her. She would become one of England's greatest monarchs, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who stared down the Spanish Armada and outlived everyone who tried to control her. But before the jewels, the speeches, and the myth, Elizabeth I was just a girl with a famous surname and very dangerous relatives. If you think your family's complicated, try being the daughter of a beheaded queen and a paranoid king with commitment issues. Born to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII in 1533, Elizabeth's early years were an exercise in royal whiplash. Declared legitimate, then illegitimate, princess one week, political inconvenience the next. And always watched. She learned early that in Tudor England, trust was a luxury and smiling could be fatal. In 1554, at the age of 21, Elizabeth was arrested and brought to the Tower of London. Her half-sister, Mary I, had just crushed a rebellion, one that hoped to place Elizabeth on the throne. Elizabeth, of course, denied all knowledge. She was interrogated and completely isolated, kept in the same fortress where her mother had died. And yes, she entered through Traitors' Gate. Because subtlety was never the Tudors' strong suit. For 2 months she lived in a kind of political purgatory, under armed guard, waiting each day to hear if it would be her last. She even carved into a window with a diamond. Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be. A sentence, a defence, and a warning. She was eventually released, too dangerous to kill, too popular to ignore. And in 1558, when Mary died, Elizabeth returned to the Tower, this time not as a prisoner, but as a queen. She entered through the very same gates, only now people bowed. Her coronation marked the start of a new era, and a very long list of people were regretting that they hadn't been especially nice to her earlier on. Elizabeth never forgot her time in the Tower. She rarely used it again, and when she did, it was with a kind of royal irony. Political opponents who once tried to bury her there now found themselves occupying her old rooms, waiting for headsmen or mercy. She didn't haunt the Tower, she weaponised the memory of it. Still, people say she returned, not in life, but after, that her spirit walks the gardens at night, not as a queen, but as the frightened young woman who once watched the door, wondering if it would open for a guard or an executioner. Elizabeth I ruled for 44 years. She gave the nation stability, identity, and a legacy written in golden ink. But part of her never left the Tower. The girl who survived it never forgot it. And we're going to leave the history there because honestly, we could go on for days. And you probably weren't watching a video on this channel unless you were hoping for ghost stories. And you will not be disappointed. Of course, history books will tell you all about the tower's royal tenants, political prisoners and occasional head removals. But for the truly chilling details, you'll want to speak to a yeoman warder. Preferably one with a fondness for understatement and a healthy respect for things that go bump during the night shift. Because here at the tower, the dead have a habit of turning up fashionably late and quite without invitation. If the Tower of London is a tombstone for England's darkest moments, then Tower Hill is the graveyard. A quiet slope now, but once a stage. And the curtain only ever closed with blood. Here, just beyond the tower walls, hundreds took their final walk. Queens, commoners, convicted coin clippers. These gates and these stones were their last view of the world. Among them, John Goose, a Lollard preacher burned for heresy in 1475. 4 church robbers hanged in 1480. John Smith, groom of King Edward's stirrup, executed for treason. And William Collingbourne, who met a full medieval overreaction. Hanged, drawn and quartered for writing a poem. History, where satire literally could kill. Death here was democratic. From Don Pantaleon Sá, brother of the Portuguese ambassador, beheaded for murder in 1654, to Mary Roberts and William MacDonald, a one-armed soldier hanged for rioting in 1780. The axe made no distinction, and neither did the noose. And when their time came, it was the yeoman warders who led them from their tower cells and handed them over to the Sheriff of London. Following the execution, their head was spiked on London Bridge, because nothing says royal deterrence like a decaying face glaring at river traffic, and the body was carted back to the tower to be buried near the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. Hardly surprising then that the gates themselves are said to be haunted. After all, this is where the condemned first saw the crowd. And indeed where the crowd first saw the condemned. One night, during the Second World War, a lone sentry was patrolling this very spot. All routine, until it wasn't. He hears footsteps, then he sees them. Out of the mist, a procession descends from Tower Hill. Men in strange antique uniforms. They move slowly, deliberately. In the centre, a crude wooden stretcher. Upon it, a headless corpse. The head is lying neatly between the arm and torso. A little too neatly, some might say. The sentry froze as the grim cortege approached. Nearly within reach, the figures vanished. Gone, not a trace. He filed a full report and it was taken seriously. Investigators found the uniforms he described matched those issued to the sheriff's men in the Middle Ages. The very men responsible for retrieving the bodies after execution and returning them for burial within the tower. The head, as history records, would be taken separately by boat down the Thames from tower steps. Everything checked out right down to the stretcher. It's easy to forget that these gates were once the threshold between life and death. But those who stood watch here in the silent hours, when memory weighs heavier than air, they remember. Once you step past the outer wall, past the threshold where execution carts once rolled and ghosts still march in procession, you reach the first of many towers that make up this brooding fortress, the Middle Tower. Built in 1280, restored in 1717, and since then, more or less behaving itself, mostly. Unlike its more infamous siblings, the Middle Tower was rarely used for imprisonment. It was simply too exposed, too near the outer gate. But even so, one particularly stylish name managed to leave its mark. Lawrence Shirley, 4th Earl Ferrers. Yes, a man whose aristocratic title was almost as dramatic as his crimes. In 1760, Lord Ferrers shot his own bailiff, a man named Johnson, during a heated dispute. Pistols, blood, scandal. The whole affair read like bad Gothic fiction, with worse consequences. He was tried and found guilty, and though he requested a silken cord as befit his rank, the Crown was not feeling generous. He swung from a common hempen rope at Tyburn. Silver embroidered waistcoats, 6-horse carriage, executed like a peasant. Honestly, it was a tough week for brand integrity. Centuries passed until 1977 when two painters were working inside the middle tower at broad daylight. Nothing unusual. That was until they heard footsteps above. Measured and unhurried, someone walking the battlements. At first they ignored it. Each assumed the other had gone for a stroll. But when the pacing resumed, and both were very much standing together in the same room, the mood shifted. The steps moved steadily above them, back and forth, then paused, then retraced, which would have been easier to stomach if there had been access to the roof. There are no connected battlements, no hidden staircase, no clever bit of Tudor masonry hiding a walkway. They checked, thoroughly, with help, and still for days the footsteps returned. Was it the murderous Earl striding through death with the same entitlement he'd carried through life? Or some other unrecorded soul whose name never made it to the ledgers but whose torment echoes all the same? Some ghosts rattle chains, others just keep walking. The middle tower may not have held many prisoners, but it seems to have held on to something. Between the inner and outer walls of the tower lies a place both open and closed, a space that's known footsteps of monarchs, traitors, queens and guards who lived long enough to regret everything. This is the outer ward, and despite its openness, it's as haunted as any cell or scaffold. This stretch between the Byward and Salt Towers is Water Lane. Today, it's stone and silence. But once, the Thames lapped at its edge and the condemned walked it towards their end. Over centuries, it saw processions of the damned. Men and women alike led towards interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. Their fear seeped into the mortar, and from time to time, something seeps back out. On one night in 1968, a Scots Guard sentry patrolling from the Byward Tower to the gloomy portal of Sally Port suddenly rushed back to the guardroom, pale and shaken. "They're following me," he gasped. Up and down my beat, they came out of the Sally Port. A full search was carried out. No intruder, no prankster, and absolutely no reason for what he'd seen. But the man had to be relieved of duty, his nerves left in tatters. Not long after, a second sentry had his own brush with the inexplicable. From the shadows, a cloaked figure emerged. Tall, slow-moving, and unmistakably headless. Now most people would probably call that a hallucination, but the sentry, he called for backup. Towering along Water Lane is the Wakefield Tower, once home to the state papers, the crown jewels, and rather inconveniently, a dungeon. Among its many distinguished residents, King Henry VI, a gentle soul, born to rule, but not to govern. After losing the crown and half of his kingdom in the Wars of the Roses, he was held here. And one night, as he prayed in his private chapel, he was sticked with a dagger full of deadly holes. Many believe his killer was Richard of Gloucester, later Richard III, but no proof ever surfaced. What has surfaced, however, is the ghost. His pale figure has been seen gliding near the chamber where he died. Always between 11 and midnight. Never earlier, never later. Because obviously, even the dead keep to a schedule. In October 1978, yet another sentry was pelted with stones from the battlements. Most of them landed near his feet, but one struck his leg. No wind, no birds, and nobody up there. Not unless someone had picked the lock and squeezed past the barred gate. Either a ghost or the most athletic pigeon in British history. The next sentry on shift, yes, he was hit with stones as well. The tower's long dead jokers, it seems, haven't lost their aim. Just across from the Wakefield Tower stands the infamous Traitors' Gate. Through here came Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and Elizabeth I, all ferried in beneath the raised portcullis. Above it sits St Thomas' Tower, not named for Thomas More, but for St Thomas Becket. And if the legend is to be believed, the good saint wasn't thrilled about it. In 1240, as the tower neared completion, a storm rose up and demolished the arch on St George's Day. The builders tried again the following year. Same result. A priest later claimed he saw Becket's ghost striking the walls with a cross, declaring the structure an insult to the Londoners. Whether divine sabotage or an early example of poltergeist property damage, the message was clear. The tower had made a new enemy. Henry III responded by naming the building after Becket and adding a tiny chapel, just in case heaven was still listening. Even today, ghosts don't keep to the towers. Mint Street, winding north from the Byward Tower, is home to some of the tower's most disconcerting encounters. One morning, a yeoman warder was on duty before dawn. A Scots guardsman approached and asked, "Has anyone passed you?" The warder walked over 200 yards alone, heard nothing and saw nothing, but he was pale. He heard an unearthly shriek, he said, followed by the sound of running footsteps. No explanation, just the sound of something fleeing in the dark. Not all the hauntings are public. Within the tower's wall-thick homes, residents have reported footsteps on empty stairs, the weeping of infants, and on one occasion, the sudden presence of a man in a grey 1940s suit. He vanished, naturally. No tragedies are tied directly to the house, but just yards away stood the secret rifle range, where enemy spies were executed during the World Wars. They faced death behind these high walls, and it seems some haven't left. Guarded by thick stone and centuries of whispered secrets, the inner ward of the Tower of London was once the exclusive stomping ground of royalty and nobility. Here stood the White Tower, the regalia, the state papers, and a gatehouse with a name as charming as a rusty axe, the Bloody Tower. Originally called the Garden Tower, presumably to lure prisoners into a false sense of security, it was later renamed for more visceral reasons. If these walls could talk, they'd probably just scream. During Queen Mary's reign, this tower held Thomas Cranmer, Bishop Latimer, and Bishop Ridley, all burned for heresy. And not in a metaphorical Twitter backlash sense, I mean actual flames. Also imprisoned here, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. He tried to make Lady Jane Grey Queen, and it didn't end well, bless him. The axe fell, and the crowd roared. John Dudley went quietly and headlessly. And let us not forget Judge Jeffreys, the charming chap known as the Hanging Judge. He was placed in the Bloody Tower for his own protection. In return, he drank himself to death on brandy. One assumes the tower needed one more room. But amongst these sinister tales, none chill the blood quite like that of Sir Thomas Overbury. A respected advisor, he made the fatal mistake of trying to talk sense into a friend, urging Robert Carr not to marry the formidable Countess of Essex. She repaid his honesty with 4 months of creative poisoning, a slow death in the Bloody Tower. Yet perhaps the most sorrowful story of all is that of the two little princes, Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard, just 9. As mentioned earlier, they were placed in the Bloody Tower by their uncle, Richard of Gloucester, where they vanished without trace. Some say one was smothered, the other stabbed. Their tiny bones were supposedly discovered centuries later, beneath the staircase in the White Tower. Today, people claim to see them, hand in hand, ghostly white gowns wandering near the tower that swallowed them whole. But it wasn't just innocents and enemies. Even the brilliant weren't spared. Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier, scientist, explorer, man with more roughs than sense, spent 13 years in the Bloody Tower, imprisoned by James I. 13 years, enough time to write a history of the world, invent 3 new methods of sulking, and catch a truly royal case of rheumatism. On the morning of his execution in 1618, Raleigh reportedly refused grooming assistance from his manservants with the immortal line, "Let them comb it, that shall have it." His spirit is said to drift through the Bloody Tower's ancient rooms and along Raleigh's Walk, the battlement wall where he once took his daily strolls. Even today, residents report seeing his spectre, and in one particularly cheeky instance, feeling him. In 1976, a yeoman warder's wife felt a hand stroke the small of her back while preparing a bath, only to realise her husband was out on watch. Unshaken, she simply muttered, "Oh, stop it, Raleigh," and carried on. I can't decide if that's British stoicism or just long-term marriage. Apparitions aren't reserved for staff either. In 1970, a visitor twice saw a woman in black velvet, white cap, and a large gold medallion standing near a window in the Bloody Tower. No records match her exactly, But let's be honest, paperwork was never the tower's strong suit. And then there was 1978. Just after midnight, 2 RAF regiment sentries halted beneath the bloody tower arch. Their cloaks suddenly billowed up around their faces, and icy winds surging from nowhere, which is alarming given there was no wind, and even the tower's ghosts aren't known for their HVAC systems. A sergeant later spotted a shadow moving behind arrow slits in a crumbling wall. It glided past each hole one by one, then vanished. No footsteps, no sound, no presence behind the wall, just the sense of being watched. Today, Tower Green is a tranquil patch of grass framed by trees, benches and sunlight, a welcome slice of calm in a place famous for anything but. One might almost forget where they are, until the wind shifts and the echo of scream reminds you this was once the most exclusive execution site in England. It's lovely, isn't it? A peaceful garden surrounded by Tudor timber, Norman stone and one very judgmental raven. But don't let the plane trees fool you. This isn't where people came to picnic, it's where they came to die. Quietly, privately, and sometimes horrifically. Executions here weren't for common criminals, no, this was royal ground for royal deaths. Among the infamous was of course Anne Boleyn herself, Queen of England, second wife to Henry VIII and mother to the future Elizabeth I. Accused of adultery, incest and witchcraft, as one does when they've fallen out of favour. She was sentenced to either be burned or beheaded, depending on the king's mood. He graciously chose the latter. On 19th of May 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold. Dressed in grey damask and crimson undergown, she knelt upright. There was no block, as a sword was to be used. A French headsman specially imported distracted her for a fleeting moment, and with one stroke of his trusty sword, it was all over. She never saw it coming, probably the kindest thing that happened to her all week. Legend claims her head, once severed, continued to move, eyes blinking, lips forming silent words. Her remains were hastily buried between the altar of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her dignity, however, remains unburied to this day. Since then, Anne's ghost has proven reluctant to leave. In 1864, a sentry bayoneted what he thought was an intruder, only to collapse in fright as his blade passed through thin air. Witnesses at the Bloody Tower confirmed what he saw, a white-clad figure gliding through the mist. It earned that guard post an evil reputation, which, let's face it, is quite the achievement at the Tower of London. She's not the only spirit clinging to the Tower Green. A grey lady walks the timbered floors of the Queen's house, seen only by women. In the 1970s, a medieval man drifted through the upper halls, while disembodied footsteps danced on staircases nobody was climbing. One American guest even reported midnight chanting, monks singing in Latin, despite the radio having remained defiantly silent. You could of course argue she was imagining it, if it hadn't happened before, more than once. And then there's the room next to where Anne spent her final days, colder than the rest. Heavier, fragrant with a sweet, sickly perfume, and known for its disturbing phenomenon. A choking, suffocating sensation experienced by those left alone to sleep in it. They don't let unaccompanied women or children sleep there anymore, which is either respectful caution or excellent risk management. But the stories don't stop at the scaffold. One officer seeing lights inside the chapel at night peered through a window, only to witness a ghostly procession of nobles walking the aisle. At the head, a woman resembling Anne Boleyn, guiding the dead towards the altar under which she herself was buried. The procession faded before his very eyes. The chills lingered long after. But of all the violent ends met here, perhaps none was more unjust, or more grotesque, than that of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Over 70 years old and guilty of nothing but birthing a son who opposed Henry VIII's reforms, she simply refused to kneel at the block. She tried to run, but the executioner chased. His axe struck her again and again. 10 times, they say, until she was hacked to death like meat in a market. Henry VIII never did take criticism well, and still the tower remembers. On the anniversary of her death, her screams are said to echo across the green. In 1975, men in the Waterloo block were awoken by piercing cries. Just days later, another guard confirmed it, a blood-curdling shriek just before dawn. Others have seen her ghost reenact that final frenzied scene, running around the site, chased by the phantom axeman, the cursed blade forever raised. On the western edge of Tower Green stands Beauchamp Tower, solid, stoic, and ever so slightly sulky. It was a favoured lodging of prisoners of rank, nobles, knights, bishops, and the unfortunate sons of overly ambitious fathers. A sort of grim Airbnb for the highborn and soon to be headless. Not that it was terribly comfortable. A fireplace, some straw, and a view of the scaffold where your friends were executed. Very cosy. But what truly sets Beauchamp apart isn't just the suffering, it's the graffiti. The state prison room is etched with the thoughts, prayers, names and emblems of those who waited, sometimes for years, for a change in political weather. Some begged for mercy, others proclaimed innocence, a few were witty, and at least one seemed to really love a woman named Jane. Jane inscribed twice on the walls, likely carved by Lord Guildford Dudley, husband to Lady Jane Grey. He was brought to the tower by his father, the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, who had the bright idea to make Jane Queen of England for roughly 9 days. Guildford, locked in the Beauchamp Tower alongside his brothers, watched the power games unfold until they lost. Jane was executed on Tower Green. Guildford too was marched to the Tower Hill and beheaded. His body was dragged back to the tower and buried beside his teenage queen. Since then, his ghost has been seen in the tower's upper chamber, drifting silently, face streaked with spectral tears. Outside along the battlements between Beauchamp and the Bell Tower, known variously as Prisoner's Walk and Elizabeth's Walk, figures have been spotted strolling despite having been dead for centuries. Hardly surprising really when you've spent your final days pacing back and forth, waiting for an axe to decide your future. It's understandable you'd walk the same path in the afterlife. Ghosts do love routine, of course. One figure seen many times here may have been James, Duke of Monmouth, leader of the doomed Monmouth Rebellion in 1685. A tall, cavalier-looking gentleman was spotted walking these walls in daylight. He fit the description of Monmouth, who once tried to buy mercy from the executioner with a few gold guineas. "Do your business well," he told the axeman. "Do not serve me as you did Lord Russell." However, he wasn't served well. It took 5 strokes to remove his head. A scarf had to be used to hide the botched job when his corpse was dressed for a posthumous portrait inside the tower. Gasps are sometimes heard when no one is present. Ornaments move from shelves without cause. And more than one visitor has left the state prison room pale and silent, as if feeling the sadness of its last tenants settling on their shoulders. Who lingers here? Is it Guildford Dudley forever mourning the girl he loved and lost? Is it Monmouth reliving the walk he once made before steel kissed his neck? Or perhaps it's one of the nameless many, their stories lost but their final thoughts quite literally set in stone. Rising 92 feet into the London sky, brooding over Tower Green and the boardwalk like a stone sovereign, the White Tower is the original Norman keep, a symbol of domination, fear and inconvenient royal paranoia. It's been standing here since the 11th century when William the Conqueror decided that nothing says "I've arrived" quite like a fortress that looks like it might eat you for breakfast. Built more for defence than decadence, this was no Tudor pleasure palace. The walls are 15 feet thick in places, windows barely bigger than arrow slits, and the stairs are cunningly clockwise to give defending swordsmen the upper hand. Which is all very clever, unless of course you're left-handed, then it's just insulting. Royalty once lived up on the upper floor, far away from riffraff and revolts, with council chambers nearby to sort out matters of state, or just accuse someone of treason before lunch. But beneath the lavish banquets and divine rites in the Chapel of St. John, something darker lurked. The White Tower's basement was a realm of shadows, a well for survival, dungeons for silence, and a torture chamber where innocents often went to die. Loudly. Take poor Anne Askew, for example. Accused of heresy, she endured the rack until her limbs were nearly torn from the sockets. Then, unable to walk, she was carted off to Smithfield and burned alive. Though mercifully, someone snuck in a bag of gunpowder to end things a little bit faster. It is nice when people show a bit of human decency during a public immolation. Anne's ghost hasn't been seen, but perhaps she's simply had enough of us. Guy Fawkes, the would-be Parliament blaster, was racked here too. Until he was a whisper of a man. Others, like Maud Fitzwalter, never even made it to trial. Imprisoned by King John for refusing his advances, she died alone in the turret, allegedly after being served a poisoned egg. Charming. And that apparently is how you inspire a revolution. Her grieving father returned to England, helped draft the Magna Carta, and gave the English people their first taste of liberty, all because of an omelette with attitude. But the White Tower didn't just confine the innocent, it crushed rebellion, and on occasion broke royalty. I'm going to try my very best not to botch his name. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, Prince of Wales, fell to his death from the roof in 1244 after a failed rope escape. His son's head was later mounted nearby, complete with a crown of ivy to fulfil a prophecy about a Welsh prince ruling in London. Even the royal quarters weren't safe. In 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had a flair for treachery and a very short fuse, accused Lord Hastings of treason in a council meeting. Then, before the poor man could even mumble "pardon me," Richard had him dragged out and beheaded, with a log as a makeshift block, and then presumably went back in for pudding. Some say the White Tower holds echoes of those last gasps. Sentries have heard screams through the dungeon doors. Security guards have seen the shadow of an axe rising high above Tower Green as if poised to fall. One warden in 1975 reported the unmistakable scent of incense in the torture chamber. There were no candles burning, no visitors present, just the faint perfume of faith in a place once filled with screams. And if you ever find yourself alone in the White Tower and feel a cold breath on your neck, do try to convince yourself it's just a draft, not something watching you through the slit in a rusted helmet. Standing watch at the northeast corner of the inner wall, the Martin Tower might not have the blood-soaked reputation of the Tower Green, or the grim infamy of the White Tower, but don't be fooled. This is the sort of place where even electricians won't work alone, and if the stories are true, neither should you. In 1865, a sentry stood guard before the tower, then the Jewel House, just as midnight struck. Suddenly, from beneath the archway, a huge ghostly bear lumbered forward. The poor man lunged in terror, bayonet first, but his weapon passed through the air and embedded itself into the heavy oak door. By the time help arrived, he was unconscious, shaking. 2 days later, he was dead. The bayonet still stuck in the door. Cause of death, spectral bear attack. Not exactly in the handbook. But it wasn't just soldiers who encountered the inexplicable. In 1817, Edmund Lenthal Swift, keeper of the Crown Jewels, sat down for dinner in the Martin Tower with his wife, son and sister-in-law. Without warning, a glassy cylinder 3 inches thick floated into the room. Inside it, bluish-white fluids churned like storm clouds in a bottle. It hovered behind Mrs. Swift, and then something grabbed her. She screamed out loud, her hands flew to her shoulder. Her son and sister saw nothing. Her husband threw a chair, and the ghost vanished. Swift, an educated man and no fan of fantasy, wrote a detailed report. He never altered a word. For him, that night was no ghost story, it was a close encounter. But the Martin Tower isn't just haunted by the condemned. It's also graced, if that's the word, by those who survived. Henry Percy, the scholarly 9th Earl of Northumberland, known as the Wizard Earl, was imprisoned here for 16 years over his cousin's role in the Gunpowder Plot. He was never tortured. He hosted salons, read science, debated theology with the likes of Sir Walter Raleigh. Imagine being so intellectually intimidating they lock you up and called it a security threat. But though Percy lived, walked and was eventually released, his ghost didn't follow suit. Late 19th century sentries refused to patrol alone by the Martin Tower. They spoke of cold spots, shadowy figures, and hands unseen that shoved them down the stone steps. And then there's George Boleyn, brother to Anne, who also did time in the Martin Tower before being executed. The air still seems charged, the walls holding their breath. But not all the tower's phantoms are out for blood. South of the Martin Tower lies the Constable Tower, now home to a yeoman warder and his wife. Since 1973, a kindly presence has made itself known, not with icy fingers or ghostly howls, but with the unmistakable smell of horses. A mix of leather, sweat, and long rides across some distant battlefield, it announces itself like a polite but pungent ghostly houseguest. When he arrives, papers blow, pens skid sideways, and the couple simply nod. "He's here again," says the warder. It's not frightening, in fact, it's oddly comforting. Guarding the southeast corner of the inner ward, the Salt Tower is a silent sentry to some of the darkest chapters in the tower's long and bloodied ledger. And if the Martin Tower gave you a ghostly nudge and a phantom bear, the Salt Tower might just reach straight for your soul. Dating from the 13th century, the Salt Tower once had no door at ground level, a subtle architectural reminder that you weren't meant to leave once you entered. It's not called a dungeon for the ambience. Many of its inmates were Jesuits, men caught in the brutal gears of Elizabethan religious persecution. One such soul was Henry Walpole, a devout Catholic who dared to return to England after witnessing the torture of his fellow priests. Arrested in 1593, Walpole endured multiple sessions on the rack, and still, he refused to betray anyone. In the dark, damp cells of the Salt Tower, he carved his name into the stone walls, along with the names of the saints who gave him the strength to endure. They say stone forgets nothing, and neither, it seems, do ghosts. In 1973, a yeoman warder, having just finished a book ridiculing the Jesuits, visited the tower alone. As he climbed the spiral stairs, the chamber suddenly lit with an unearthly glow, and something touched the back of his neck. His flight was instinctive. He never finished the book, or kept it. And it's not just sensations that trouble this place. In 1957, two guardsmen on patrol spotted a shapeless white form floating high above the battlements of the Salt Tower. It hovered in place, then slowly faded into the night. Not every ghost wears a face. Some just linger. Then in 1976, as the nearby History Gallery was being constructed, workmen dug beside the old Roman wall and unearthed a grave. Then in 1976, as the nearby History Gallery was being constructed, workmen dug beside the old Roman wall and unearthed a grave. 15 feet down lay a skeleton, knees bent, arms crossed, head turned sharply to one side. An ugly hole gaped in the skull. A man, possibly Iron Age, nearly 2,000 years old. The earliest human remains ever found in the city. No name, no story, and no justice. Only questions. Did he fall or was he struck? Did he die in battle or betrayal? And more importantly, does he still wander the gallery that now looms over his disturbed grave, searching for answers that time itself has forgotten? Most of the tower's ghostly encounters have come not from vigils or seances, but from the boots of the ground watchmen, sentries and yeoman warders. After all, they're the ones who prowl the grounds in the loneliest hours, when the rest of the world sleeps and the veil is thinnest. But don't get too comfortable, because you, dear viewer, aren't necessarily off the hook. If you visit the Tower of London, wander its echoing halls, gaze too long into the dark recess of its towers, don't assume the past will leave you in peace. For the tower remembers, and memory here is no passive thing. It breathes, it watches, and it waits. Maybe it's a scent, old incense or leather tack, a sound, a whisper on the stairs, footsteps where nobody walks. So it is with the ghosts of the Tower of London. They don't all need to scream or slam doors. Some simply watch. If you've enjoyed this descent into the haunted heart of England's most infamous fortress, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales where history and hauntings shake hands in the dark. Until next time, I'm your host, Severed Soul.